Response to Authoritarian Capitalism, the Recent Political Shifts for Labor Environmentalism. My name is Melanie Pichler. I'm a professor for social ecology at Universität in Vienna. And I'm very happy to moderate this panel today that aims to function as an introductory panel to this conference and to discuss some of the contemporary challenges and contexts for labor environmentalism. Thanks again to Kara for this very interesting keynote talk. What we will discuss today are some of the questions associated with the recent climate backlash and how this interacts with labor environmentalism, about fascist tendencies and far-right politics, and how these have shifted the conditions for labor environmentalism. At the same time, we will talk about ambiguous relationships between activists and workers, as well as the diversity of the workforce itself, and opportunities and challenges for a unified working class environmental movement. I'm very happy to discuss these and many more questions with three excellent experts here at the panel, but obviously also with all of you in the audience. We had a slight change in plans, as you might notice. Emanuele Leonardi is unfortunately not able to join us. He got sick, and we also we only heard about this over the weekend, so unfortunately we could not have an appropriate replacement, but I'm sure that on the one hand there are so many experts in the audience, so maybe we're gonna expand a little bit the discussion, and there is so much expertise on the panel. So I'm sure that we're gonna have a very interesting discussion. I would like to introduce the panel to you first before we proceed with, not with necessarily individual inputs or presentations, but more a discussion style panel. So to my left, I'm very happy to welcome Silpa Satheesh. She is an assistant professor at the Indian Institute of Management in Kerala, and her current project is on climate change and informal workers. To my right, I'm happy to introduce Stefanie Hürtgen. She is an associate professor at the University of Salzburg in Austria, and also a permanent fellow at the Frankfurt Institute for Social Research, where she is currently doing a research project on changing labor relations and working class activities in the global battery supply chain from a transnational perspective. And further to my left, I'm happy to introduce Simon Schaupp. He is a research professor at the KU Leuven in Belgium, and he's also project leader at the Frankfurt Institute for Social Research, so we have colleagues here. And his current project is on workers' orientations in the context of climate change. And I would like to start the panel with you, Silpa, also, although she was hesitant to start, but I would like you to introduce us a bit to your work in India and how you would understand the shifts that I mentioned in the introduction. How would you understand these shifts from an Indian or even more wider global South perspective?
Thank you so much. It's a privilege and pleasure to be here today. I thank Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung and also HWR Berlin, and specifically Marcus for giving me this opportunity. So that's a great question to start with, and it's a huge one too. So in the context of India, and I also want to clarify that I cannot speak for the entire global south. My experience and cases are also limited to India and the context that I'm studying. So of course, this cannot be generalized and applied across all countries and settings and people in the global south. However, in the context of India, there is a rise of authoritarian populism, and you can see that playing out in the form of the recent labor codes that came out that significantly affect the ability of workers to collectivize, unionize, and also their ability to bargain for better wages and working conditions. And my research is more focused on a southern Indian state called Kerala, which is slightly different from the rest of the country because it has a long history of working class struggles. It almost had communist government, so it was the first state for that matter where a communist government could come to power through parliamentary democracy. So it stands out in that regard. And because of this long history of peasant revolts and working class struggles, the trade union movement also had a very strong hold in the state, especially during the 20th century. So this is the context in which I was doing research, and specifically I'm trying to understand the conflicts between trade unions and working class environmental movements in Kerala. My research is focused around an issue of industrial pollution in central Kerala. It's an industrial belt. So there are two movements that came out, one to oppose industrial pollution in the region, composed by workers who are in the informal sector, daily wage earners without any formal contracts, etc. And on the other side, there is also an active trade union movement of workers working inside the industries, which is called as a Standing Council for Trade Unions. So these are largely, it has all the major trade unions in India, which are affiliated to formal political parties. They came together and formed a consortium to protect the interests of the industries from environmental activists, which are of grassroots nature. So for me, the question of labor environmentalism is also about the multitudes of subjectivities that labor emulates. That is dependent on the resource dependence of the workers, which sector are they involved in, and the kind of consciousness that they have surrounding the environment. So in the context of my setting, I would say the backlash or authoritarian or populist understanding of eco-modernism, or what does it mean to fight for the environmental justice, can also be problematic when we look at them from a binary of right versus left, because a political left government can also come across and expand wanting to produce more economic growth, more development, and compromise on environmental justice. At least that's what the case I worked on showed to me. There are 3 points I would like to highlight. First, if I try to understand the conflicts between these two movements, first, there was heterogeneity of working classes, that you cannot sort of compartmentalize all workers under one category. They are highly varied. And somebody was asking a question about subjectivity, the way in which they talk about what do they mean by working class or belonging to a class of workers, etc., was significantly different across the groups, ideological as well as in terms of their social identities, caste, class, gender, sexuality, etc. So it was difficult to just sort of compartmentalize them all into one and asking why is there no solidarity? There is no automatic solidarity across workers. In fact, they are fighting with each other. The second one was the role of the state and local industries in terms of forming a very strong nexus. And in fact, they were successful in co-opting the industrial workers' trade unions so that they fight and repress the local environmental justice movement, which also was very interesting in terms of the strategies that they use, that most often are used by social movements. They launched a massive counter campaign where they mobilized participants, they recruited participants and staged huge demonstration, quote unquote, mass-based demonstrations through block recruitment. They also did a lot of counter-framing campaigns against the green activists or grassroots environmentalists, saying that they were funded by foreign agencies, they were terrorists, they are engaging in anti-national activities, were being actively funded by Western countries so that the industries in India will not, thrive. And there were also a lot of discrediting, which eventually led to the demobilization of this local environmental justice movement. So it is a very tricky thing to understand the way in which labor environmentalism or working class movements try to enhance a fight for environmental justice because it's a survival thing for them. So you talk about Anthropocene, you talk about the rising inequalities happening across the world, but without understanding this intersectionality of social and environmental vulnerabilities, where the fallouts of climate change disproportionately falls on poor and working class households, especially in the context of India, informal workers, where 80% of the workers are located without any form of labor law protection. So for me, it is a complicated story where we have to do a lot more ethnographic investigations to understand how these subjectivities are formed, one. Second, how do this hegemony is actually operationalized in the grassroots? What is this interpretive work that is happening on the field? Structurally, of course, they are all workers. They are at odds with capital, but sometimes they have to form alliances with capital, especially the institutionalized trade unions. However, to understand better the fragmentation of class interests, you need to have more ethnographies to sit and talk with people to understand how do they legitimize standing in for or against capital accumulation, or standing for eco-modernization, or against environmental justice. So this is what I want to begin this dialogue with. Hopefully, we'll add more. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Silpa, for directly diving into the regional and local contexts. We will make a little bit of a shift now with Stefanie. The question I would like to give you at the beginning is about right-wing politics, fascist tendencies that have become increasingly important also in the labor force. From your perspective, also from your research experience, how would you understand this shift?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Thanks that you are all here, and thanks. Yeah, it's good to be here, I want to say. It's a huge question again, so I have made some notes, and I try to answer it in two steps, so to say. The first step is, and I think this is important, fascisation, as it is called now, rests up and is not only a question of the far right, but it is implicated in capitalism and in particular authoritarian neoliberalism. Authoritarian neoliberalism in a way prepares fascism, fascisation we can say, because it is on programmatic desolidarization and, even more important, social Darwinism. There was a big debate in the beginning of the 90s or end of 80s about social Darwinism, which is, as far as I see, not much implicated in the ecological debate. This is false. Neoliberalism, authoritarian neoliberalism, is an attack on every class-related organization that orients for solidarity, collectivism, but also internationalism. These attacks push forwards nationalistic, regionalistic, but also individualistic formations as an economic competitor against, or as economic competitors against each other. These social and political attacks are carried out in the name of economic success, in the name of a divided and particularized economic fight in which we all have to strengthen ourselves against each other. The other is the competitor. This policy has dramatically changed working and living conditions with an enormous shift towards extensification, individualization, flexibilization, precarization, and intensification of work and informalization as well. Workers are squeezed out, are exhausted, as they say themselves, while social systems are dismantled. However, and this is important, this social Darwinism and policies under authoritarian neoliberalism still take place in a, I would say, discursive bubble which propagates at the same time values as freedom, equality, modernity, self-development, and progress. One favorite example for me is the Amazon slogan, which you find in any entry of the Amazon's stores, work hard, have fun, make history. So fake news are not coming up with the AfD or Trump. They are every day experienced by workers under authoritarian neoliberalism. Fascisation now turns the de facto social Darwinism, I would say, into an explicit program. It destroys the liberal talk, or we can say propaganda, and turns recklessness into an explicit agenda. Elon Musk is famous when was famous when he states that empathy is the fundamental weakness of the Western world, and we will discuss in the automotive stream what that means for the workers. So fascisation, as we all know, is a programmatic recklessness, and this includes fights against all those movements and actors that question this recklessness. Left groups, which Trump labels as Marxist, I think this is important, feminist and queer activists, those who refer to the '68 movement, green movements, anti-fascist movements, and others. So what is in this picture the nevertheless turn of many workers, as you describe it too, to the, let's say, far right of fascisation? This is the second step now. I would call this turn, not of all of them, this is important, but of a lot of them, of workers, is the expression of the social tipping points of our social ecological catastrophe. These social tipping points are as important as the ecological ones. This is what I want to argue. And we don't grasp them enough when we look only at political votings, you know, voting for the far right and so on. This is only, I would say, the political surface. And it is not only, also not only about the dramatic experiences of poverty, exclusion, attacks against their livelihoods and lives and bodies, but these social tipping points, I argue, are about the change of a subjectivity. And we already spoke about that subjectivity now, and we have to go in depth. Not enough regarded to and not enough taken into account by ecological movements, even by trade unions often. There is a whole working class culture, we can say. There are struggles about dimensions which workers themselves express as struggles about their humanity, dignity, and, as was already mentioned in the panel before, about their work as something, and the products they produce as something meaningful. I mean, many of you maybe now hesitate and say, but what has this to do with, you know, left-wing policies? There's nothing, no talk about socialism, whatever. What is about humanity, you know? But I think this is false. Dignity, as John Holloway says, is a political category. And of course, I don't say neither that workers are pre-revolutionary. Yeah? They are implicated in the exploitation conditions. They are producing, as Nora Rätzel said in the other panel, they are producing value at the same time. They are part of the whole commodity and exploitation structure. But there are everyday struggles about dignity and humanity and meaningfulness in capitalist production. And they have a wide range of forms. They start with low level, we can say, little forms of collegiality and solidarity, up to the affirmation of oneself as the producer, as someone who cares for meaningful work, for their own product as something that is important for others. These are everyday practices long before the cases that Emanuele Leonardi should more refer to, the GKN and so on. So under the surface, so to say, of the uprising, you know, taking over of factories, there's an everyday culture and everyday practice, very contradictory, of course, which we should look at. Because, and this is my conclusion, fascisation among workers, I would argue, is the loss of this everyday orientation towards humanity, towards dignity, and meaningfulness. It is the loss, the giving up of these dimensions in their everyday struggles and orientations. It is even an explicit turn away from all these dimensions, and hence the loss also of the very basic idea that in principle we can have human, for example, relations, meaningful working relations to each other. Dignity becomes instead something like it is necessary to be not to be the loser but the winner. So there's a turn. And as I said, I would suggest to think these expressions of the social tipping points as important as the ecological ones, if we want to divide that for the moment, because as social and ecological beings, we altogether are not only dependent on climate conditions, temperature and so on, but also on a minimum of a careful treatment among each other as human beings, within and against otherwise structural and political recklessnesses.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Stefanie. Simon, we've heard about fascisation, about authoritarian turns. You've done a lot of interviews with workers in different sectors on environmental consciousness and agency. Would you see any differences, any shifts in recent years concerning the more structural changes we've just mentioned?
Thank you, Melanie, for this very interesting question, which really invited me to reflect on the historical development over the last year when I talked to workers. And there is one aspect that I think is particularly worth mentioning in how this changes through the last years. And there I would say what we see is a change of how workers we talk with talk about climate issues, ecological issues, as a development from something that happens with specific persons at specific places and in specific times. For example, climate activism, climate demonstrations in Europe, Fridays for Future, then what occurs often in the interviews like the lignite open pit mining, the question of closure of these mines. So all of these are specific political events, specific political times. For example, there was this coal commission where this is then located at a specific time in a specific place. And I have the impression that over the years, this narrative changed. So when we talk about climate change with workers now, it is much more entangled with their everyday practices and everyday struggles. And I think this is really important because we as activists and scientists can really learn something from that. And I would like to explain that a little bit. So what I mean with this entanglement is that workers don't say, okay, there is something very far away in, for example, Ossetia or at the demonstration, but it's entangled in the most basic struggles that they have, in all of the history of capitalism. For example, struggles over time or struggles over democracy. So for concrete examples regarding time, I think even before we talk about conflicts on ecological transformation, there is already on an everyday basis under the climate crisis a real struggle for adaptation, for even holding up the status quo. For example, when we talk to construction workers, the construction companies say really clearly, okay, we have a dramatic loss of productivity because of climate change. This is happening in Germany, in Switzerland, where we have a relatively moderate climate. But there, for example, the Swiss Employers Association says we are losing 25 days of productivity every year due to climate change. So what we want you to do is work more, raise working hours to 58 hours a week. This is really something that workers have to struggle with on an everyday basis, and then they have to formulate their response. And the response is here to demand a reduction of working time. In this case, it takes the form of paid leave in the case of extreme weather. Right? So it's not something that happens only when you occupy your factory and transition it towards producing sustainable windmills or whatever, but it happens really on an everyday basis. And the same is true for the question of democracy at the level of the workplace. So of course, capitalist labor processes rely really on some forms of domination. in some cases they might be hidden forms of domination and control, but this is something like a constant. And this is also experienced by workers as attacks on their dignity. They have everyday experience of being subjugated. This is nothing new. But there is a new layer of subjugation that we witness in these interviews when it comes to climate adaptation or climate mitigation. Because the reforms that are necessary are so structural and so fundamental that it really affects how people go about in their working lives, and this is a really relevant aspect for most people of their lives. But then they see that these transformations are kind of put on them from above, like in some cases from politicians or from their managers, and they don't have any say in that. They experience this as some kind of technocratic transformation, and this produces a high level of alienation and a new resurgence of the question of workplace democracy under new kind of circumstances, or in a way that is even more pressing than it was before, because this has the dramatic side effect that from this experience of being alienated from technocratic climate policy, then workers become, in some instances, vulnerable to right-wing populist mobilization, which mobilizes them against ecology per se. So this is something that we maybe talk about also later. But I think here this embeddedness in everyday struggles is really something that is shifting, and it's also happening on the side of capital. So in the Swiss example, again, in the construction sector, not only the workers are forced to focus on climate issues, but for example, the Employers Association names climate policy as one of their 4 core policy areas. So this really shows us that even an agency that is obviously not designed for engaging in climate policy thinks that this is a core element of their everyday business, and then they advocate for basically projects of maladaptation. So, for example, demolishing energy inefficient buildings instead of renovating them. And so here we have a whole a field of politics, of policy that is really something that we should not project to singular events such as the GKN factory takeover or Lucas Aerospace or all of these spectacular cases that we are very well aware of. Because I think that focusing on these cases as like the only thing that you can respond if you're asked what about labor environmentalism actually has maybe sometimes a kind of a counterproductive effect, because for most people that means, okay, this is something that is completely unimaginable in my workplace. This has nothing to do with me, so I keep on doing like what we've always did. So I would really strongly argue and pick up what Stefanie said before, that we really need to focus on this entanglement of ecological issues with everyday struggles.
Thank you very much, Simon. With the next round of questions, we would like to understand a bit better about maybe more internal challenges and opportunities of working class environmentalism, how to deal with an increasingly fragmented labor force. What about alliances within the labor force, but also with activists, with climate activists, for example, and also lessons learned from existing struggles. Silpa, I would like to start again with you. As you already said in your work, you focus specifically on the role of informalization and ecological precarity. Can you elaborate a little bit more on these challenges, but hopefully also opportunities that may arise from this?
Thank you for the question, Melanie. So I would build on what I tried to say a little while ago. So the fragmented nature of class interests was the biggest impediment in terms of forming any sorts of dialogue between the trade union consortium, SCTU, and the local grassroots environmental movement. I'm calling it a name, PMVS. It's a Malayalam name, so I don't want you to, or I can rather say Periyar Malinikarana Viruddha Samiti. It's a campaign against pollution of the river Periyar. So in terms of the difficulty in forming an alliance came across through the interviews. The first thing was it was composed of different categories of workers. So the other one, self-explanatory, they are factory workers inside the chemical factories who were lining on the banks of this particular river, River Periyar. And the local environmentalists were a group of informal workers. Most of them did daily wage labor. And a lot of them actively were trying to represent the grievance of inland fish workers and farmers who were gravely affected by the pollution of this particular river. So you can see two categories of workers who are on either side of the fight with very different material interests. So if you pollute the river more, the inland fish workers are finding it hard to get a decent catchment every day. On the other hand, if you're asking the factory to close down because of pollution, then of course there are thousands of workers employed in these factories. So there was a clear opposition in terms of interest on either side of the movement. So that created the primary difficulty in terms of coming to the bench and talking, or coming to the table and talking about some sort of an alliance. The second one was also the social hierarchy in every society is also reflective in terms of trade unions. So and also in terms of your location within the trade union ladder. So it was difficult to sort of see both of these labor collectives on the same plane in terms of power and access to the centers of political party, etc., and social collective bargaining. So in the context of India, especially in the context of informalization, Rand Bremen actively talked about the labor aristocrat or the labor salariat versus the rest of the working class communities in the country. So something similar was also visible here, where the informal workers did not have a lot of power, not of access to political parties, so they were largely using crowdsourcing to mobilize against the polluting industries. They never asked the industries to close down. All they were asking was to implement systems so that you can regulate pollution and stop releasing chemical effluents into the river. They also created a case where they tried to show how much work is actually being produced because people were actually relying on the river. More than 10,000 people were eking their living out by fishing and doing farming on the banks of the river. The union workers, on the other hand, were worried that the protests are going to close down the factories very soon. A couple of factories were actually forced to close down for non-compliance, so that also increased the sense of alarm among the local industries. And during the conversation, it was also very clear that they were not against protecting the environment. However, they wanted more economic growth, more progress, and they also wanted to sort of come out of this tainted image of labor in Kerala, which historically have been portrayed as militant and stopping the influx of private capital into the state. So throughout the interviews, the trade union leaders said that we want to fix this image that we have carried. This has become a burden for us, that we have been preventing private capital from operating and accumulating. We need more progress and more economic growth. Of course, we respect the nature, but it should not come in the way of achieving more progress for the people of this land. So this, and on the other hand, when I talk to the local environmentalists and grassroots environmental actors who are part of the other movement, they were talking in terms of environmental justice. They said, of course, we are not worried only about the environment. We are worried about our survival. Our livelihood is dependent on the access of and availability of these clean resources, which were common pool resources, in other words. So if you don't continue ensuring that we have access to this, how are we going to survive? Either we have to also switch sectors, and this has historically happened and is still happening across India, where people who are reliant on resource-dependent livelihoods, like the traditional artisanal fisher folk, either because of privatization or the state coming up with blue economy narratives, they are forced to move to other sectors and find other jobs, which again are, in the informal sector, losing the traditional ways of living, wisdom, etc. So they said, we want to continue. If we want to continue living by the banks of the river, you need to stop pollution. So coming back to the question on fragmentation, the different subjectivities are deeply embedded in their location and their economic interests. So it's not just identities, it's also the entanglement, the word that Simon used a little while ago. It's deeply embedded in class, social everyday life, and also, the way of living and the sense of community for that matter. So the moment pollution started, it created a rupture in the local ecology and also the society, so that they divided into two groups and were actively fighting, where one group was struggling a lot to establish the ill effects of pollution, whereas the other group is trying to come up with an image that says that this is a hoax, that there is no pollution, and that the liver is completely clean. And so it brings you a standstill, and you don't know where to start conversing. And both sides have valid points. And throughout my research, that is one thing I wanted to ensure, that the lived experience of these workers are very different, and the locations are so different. It's difficult to pit one group against another, but the structural complexities compel them to take a particular stand. And here, unfortunately, the institutionalized trade unions have decided to stand with the industries. And the state, because it wants to now fix the image of becoming a state which is inviting capital, which wants to score up high in the ladder of ease of doing business, it doesn't want to amplify the role of a militant state. So the shift in class politics in Kerala would explain the fragmentation that happens, and it is severely limiting working class solidarity. You also asked me about the opportunities. Yeah, it is very difficult for me to speak about opportunities at this point. However, one thing, the parallel project was on informal workers and climate change. So a lot of workers are actually feeling they're being hit by climate change. They are unable to carry out their everyday work, but they are not collectivized. And a lot of institutionalized trade unions rather keep a silent note on climate change. They want to talk about other grievances, which they're very well doing. But however, institutionalized trade unions in India are not actively talking about climate change. It is the alternative trade unions that are actively mobilizing. Even you took at the platform workers, gig workers, or informal labor. So they are doing the mobilization. So the hope perhaps lies in forming an alliance where the trade unions also start listening to alternative grassroots movement groups, which are working with informal workers. Thank you. I'll wrap there.
Thanks a lot, Silpa. Simon, you, in your research, the aspects of experience and knowledge actually are quite important. You could also maybe frame these as forms of dignity for workers. Why do you think is this important for labor environmentalism?
I think it's a core issue in many labor struggles, but specifically in struggles around ecological issues, because here we require a specific kind of knowledge, namely scientific knowledge, if we want to talk about climate change, because climate change isn't like a local rise in like 0.5 degrees of temperature, but it only makes sense if you see it through globally aggregated models of data. And this is, of course, also highly present in the climate movements, political strategy, political communication, which is very much focused on scientific communication. And that, again, has effects on the way that we perceive climate change as a whole as an issue. So awareness on climate change has become practically synonymous with knowledge and acceptance of scientific facts. And I think it's necessarily so. So I don't want to argue against that on principle, but we should reflect that this knowledge is also embedded in social hierarchies, that it's not only something that is communicating a specific information that can be true or false, but it's also communicating a specific social status. And I think this is really important strategically, because obviously people that engage in these types of communication are typically knowledge workers, which are in a hierarchical division of labor often the superiors to manual workers. And I think there the academic, the scientific knowledge becomes really strongly entangled with a kind of a managerial stance. So, for example, when we talk to construction workers, they say, "Oh, these climate people, I don't really understand them. They are only numbers crunchers. They don't know about the real world. They only see the world through numbers, through their scientific models, and that's completely different to how we relate to the world. And it's actually hostile to our position. And this." them perceiving this as hostile is explained by the fact that they use the same term as numbers crunchers for their supervisors. They say, okay, these are the managers, the academic engineers. These are the boys from university that have never worked, but they come here with their Excel sheets and then they tell us what to do. So we really see here that this kind of scientific knowledge, this very specific way of communicating the ecological crisis, is then interpreted against this experience in the workplace, and this is an experience of subjugation that is connected to this kind of both scientific and managerial stance to the world. So I think what follows from that strategically, and we also see this in other sectors, like in the energy sector as an central issue of conflict with the transformation to renewable energies, is that it's really important to take seriously the experiential knowledge of workers as a transformation resource. Not only because that will enable more effective transformations. For example, when we talk to workers in the energy sector or in the construction sector or forestry sector, basically all of them have very concrete suggestions on how their work could be made more sustainable, but they are kind of hopeless because they know that nobody is going to listen to them anyways. This makes possible transformation strategies less effective. But what is even more dramatic, I think, is that I mentioned this before. This alienates workers from climate mitigation. And I think this is really an important source of the current anti-green backlash, because fascists can really mobilize this experience of workplace subjugation in a general anti-scientific resentment. And I think this anti-scientific resentment, this anti-intellectualism, is really at the core of the anti-green backlash. And this needs to be addressed also on an effective level, on a level of dignity, where I think this appreciation of practical, of embodied, of experiential knowledge is absolutely crucial.
Thanks a lot, Simon. Based on these discussions on informalization and knowledge, I would like to ask you, Stefanie, on difficult alliances, maybe as well in your research. You draw attention to an oftentimes visible clash between left-green activism and everyday experiences of workers. I would like to invite you to elaborate a little bit on that, and also what might be important to form better alliances.
Yeah, thanks again for the question. Again, a big one. So I look at my notes. So I have, I think, 3 points for both of the sides, if you want to speak so. So for first, the ecological movements as I see them or as I perceive them, and then, but also for workers, critical points and trade unions. So I start with the first 3 points for the ecological movement. And I think one very important issue is that the first one is that the ecological movement, or people in the ecological movement and so on, do not enough reject neoliberal consumerism as the main entrance when it comes to ecological questions. These neoliberal economic theories states that we are all consumers and we shape markets and hence societies via our own individual consumption. And many people in the ecological debate follow this assumption. Even worse, I would say, there's a certain contempt, we can call this classism, towards workers, because it seemed to be them to be, you know, the uneducated, meat-eating people who did not understand yet that a train is better than an airplane and who hinder ecological transformation. And it is not stated enough that first, this individual consumption changes nothing in the world system of capitalism with globalized markets for nearly all commodities. I don't speak here, of course, about political campaigns, but neoliberalism and this consumption ideology we are every day faced off with. So during Christmas, you could buy a ecological tree and so on. It does not stop. So, but this neoliberalism idea of consumption is an individualized one. So I don't speak here about political collective campaigns. They can change things, we know. But this individualized perspective is not enough rejected, and this has to do with a lack of understanding of globalized capitalism. So as you said, I make research on transnational battery production as an example, but it is forced to think ourselves in the supermarkets and choosing, between an ecological cheese or another one. This does not change anything. This is the first entry point, which is difficult when it comes to neoliberal consumerism, which has to be changed. And the second one, it is Nisikat Neckel, a German sociologue, who discussed in a recent article, he is online, he can be read, it is very important to read, that workers, in his case in Germany, already fulfilled the targets, to reduce emissions and so on. But it is what he calls super rich that smash them with their helicopters, private airplanes and yachts and so on. So the first point, I think the ecological movement has really rejected more offensively neoliberal consumerism. The second point is those who integrate for these reasons also that I described in the first point, the class question, often refer only to jobs and income. So workers in this perspective are only seen as job holders and as those who earn money. Yeah? I mean, the question of jobs in capitalist production is important. I think we know all that also in academia and in the activism milieu, because we have to earn money and so on. I don't want to deny that at all. But nevertheless, what is falling short is that workers are first of all working. So they are the producers of most of the things we use here in our everyday life. And the struggle about dignity that I described in the first part is completely overseen. Even worse, in this, job-concentrated, wage-concentrated form to integrate the class question, workers often are only a kind of tool. They are not really partners when it comes to the social ecological change. It is often stated explicitly, for example, by Matthew Huber and others, but also implicitly that we are those who have understood that we need an ecological turn, and we need the force, the strikes, and the votes, most importantly, of the workers. But workers in this picture, in this job-focused and wage-focused picture, are no allies with their creativity, with their knowledge, experience, and so on in this ecological and social change that is needed. Okay, the third point I skip maybe for the discussion, because I want to go to the 3 points, critical points when it comes to workers and trade unions. They are very important too. And when I say here that we have to integrate, and I think we are here for that, the class question in the social ecological debate and policies, this is not, of course, to say that workers and trade unions are the good guys. This is not at stake. So I have 3 points also when it comes to workers, and I put it together with trade unions. The first thing is there's a dramatic lack of internationalization. We all know, for example, that the ecological propaganda for electronic turn or green turn and so on in Europe is very much based on a dramatic rise of destruction. We can call it super exploitation. I have some difficulties with that notion, but never mind. So with an enormous dramatic acceleration of destruction in the global south, when it comes to lithium in Latin America, to cobalt in Congo, to nickel in Indonesia, and so on. But also in Europe, internationalization is not here, to say it like this. We have struggles about the lithium mine in Serbia at the moment. We will have them in France and Spain and other countries. But also the contemporary movement in Belgium about the pension reform takes place 2 years after more or less the same movement against these pension reforms in France. And when there was this big movement against the pension reform in France, I think there was not really a sign of solidarity from the side of trade unions, neither the workers. Of course, I mean, in all these issues, there are grassroots initiatives, but and the labor movement has always been also on the question of internationalization. I mean, Rosa-Luxemburg, we are here in the Rosa-Luxemburg Foundation, stands for this. But I would argue that 30 years after authoritarian neoliberalism, national corporatism, also in many trade unions is extremely strong and hinders the change of the balances of power in Europe and beyond. So this was the first point. The second point is a dramatic lack of politicization, again, of both workers and trade unions. First, in the sense that the struggles about dignity, humanity, and meaning of production described above stay, in a sense, private issues of each worker. They are not, or not enough, politicized. Of course, there are counterexamples, like the famous strikes and movements in the hospitals. But in the whole, there is a dramatic lack to strengthen that question about the meaning of what we produce and the sense of the production. But I do speak about the lack of politicization also in a different sense. There's a, I would say, dramatic gap in clearing the relation with what I would call authoritarian state apparatuses in Germany, but also in many other countries. As we know, ecological activists are persecuted as terrorists. Anti-fascists are persecuted and put in jail as terrorists. Trade unions so far, I come to the end. I don't see my notes. Trade unions so far do not position themselves to this issue. Whereas we know, or we should know, that rising trade union busting is, of course, related to this authoritarian persecution of ecological and anti-fascist activists. And I don't have to be, in line with every demand and every request that is put on the table by these social movements to develop a sort of solidarity with them also from the trade union side. And the third point, and this leads back to the first panel, the first keynote, the third point is there's a lack, both again among workers but also on trade union side, about the notion of labor. The meaning of labor. I mean, the pride to be the producer of a given commodity, of a product, and so has a dark side, as we know, and you developed this in the first part. This is productivity, the issue or the fetish of productivity. And despite the fact that during Corona, the COVID crisis, we have had big debates about the foundational economy, about the need for caring issues in the society. There is a less or not enough, bringing together these issues with industrial production, which would be to question what kind of economy, what kind of work, what kind of production is needed. So this would be the notion of labor and the ability also to be proud as a worker, not only about industrial outcomes, but also about caring issues, about reproductive issues is at stake, and there's a lack that we should fulfill if possible.
Thank you very much, Stefanie. We now open the floor to you, the audience, and there's going to be a microphone. I have to give it to you? No. We will collect. Yeah, we have one question here.
Also erstmal, mein Englisch ist total scheiße. Vielleicht kannst du so ein bisschen übersetzen, das wäre total nett. Also mein Name ist Thorsten, ich bin seit 40 Jahren bei VW beschäftigt und arbeite da in der Produktion. arbeitet da auch in Schichten. Ich finde es total interessant, wie ihr über uns Arbeiter redet. Das ist erstmal sehr, sehr interessant. Also das erste große Hauptproblem, was jeder Beschäftigter hat, ist, er will seinen Arbeitsplatz sicher haben. Weil so ein Arbeitsplatz ist ja nun ein Mittel, was man erstmal braucht zum Überleben, dass die Kinder satt werden, dass man die Miete bezahlen kann und so weiter. Der Arbeitsplatz steht im Vordergrund und da ist natürlich, Bertolt Brecht hat das mal so gesagt gehabt, erst kommt das Essen und dann kommt die Moral. Wenn jetzt rechte Gruppierungen kommen und erzählen, wir haben eine Idee, wie eure Arbeitsplätze erhalten bleiben können. Wir bauen weiterhin Verbrenner oder was weiß ich. Dann werden viele, weil sie abhängig sind von dem Arbeitsplatz, dieser Argumentation natürlich folgen. Ne? Das ist schon mal ganz klar. Und da ist das Klimathema. Da steht natürlich für die Leute, die um ihren Arbeitsplatz bangen, ganz schwer erstmal da reinzukommen und in eine Diskussion zu kommen und da die Kolleginnen und Kollegen zu motivieren, daran mitzuarbeiten. Und da finde ich es eben auch ganz wichtig, dass man so ein paar Dinge in den Gewerkschaften diskutiert. Erstmal, wie negativ das ist mit dem Standortnationalismus, die Politik, die viele Gewerkschaften betreiben. Wir produzieren billiger als wie unsere Kollegen bei Stellantis. Wir arbeiten länger als wie die Chinesen und die Japaner. Und natürlich tun die Japaner und die Stellantis-Kollegen genauso, werden die unter Druck gesetzt. Und es gibt da keine Solidarität, sondern es wird den Kolleginnen und Kollegen unter der Nase gerieben. Wenn du deinen Arbeitsplatz behalten willst, dann geht das nur, wir machen es noch billiger und noch schneller und noch mehr Arbeitsplätze. Und das ist ein Thema, dem muss man sich annehmen in Verbindung, weil das sorgt für Klimagerechtigkeit auch, Arbeitszeitverkürzung. Jedes Produkt, was wir nicht produzieren, ist ein gesundes Produkt für die Umwelt. Das muss ganz massiv diskutiert werden. Und das Zweite, was diskutiert werden muss, mir macht man ja auch immer Angst und sagt, ach jetzt kommen die Klimaaktivisten, was meinst du denn, was hier an der Arbeit und wir müssen alles umstellen und morgen sieht es hier ganz anders aus. Also wenn ich als Beschäftigter durch die Bahn gehe, da gibt es ganz viele Wellen und Strukturteile bei der Bahn. Und ich frage meine Kollegen dann, hättest du was dagegen, wenn man morgen die Welle in eine Straßenbahn oder in ein Auto reinsteckt? Nee, da habe ich nichts dagegen. Hauptsache, ich behalte meinen Arbeitsplatz. Und da merkt man auch, wie man in die Diskussionen reingehen muss. Und wenn ich in die überfüllten Bahnen gehe und gucke, wie mir so eine Bahn zusammengebaut ist, das sind Strukturteile, da sind Wellen drin, das ist alles etwas, was wir auch bei Volkswagen in Kassel Komponenten von heute auf morgen fertigen könnten. Und ich finde, da muss auch die Diskussion ansetzen, dass wir auch ein Bild zeichnen, dass es keine Verluste sind, dass wir jetzt Opfer bringen müssen für die Klimagerechtigkeit, dass wir arbeitslos werden müssen, dass unsere Enkel noch irgendwann Kinder, dass die irgendwann noch mal Arbeit haben. Wir müssen genau in die andere Richtung anfangen zu diskutieren. Die Chancen, die da drin stecken und auch mutig sein, über die Firmenlogos und über die Landesgrenzen hinaus zu diskutieren und ganz offensive Forderungen wieder stellen, wie Arbeitszeitverkürzung. Und wenn ich immer das so über die Entfremdung der Arbeit höre, also die erste Entfremdung ist ja, wer entscheidet, unter welchen Bedingungen ich arbeite? Wer entscheidet, was ich produziere? Und das sind auch die Diskussionen, die man ganz klar anspitzen muss in dem betrieblichen, in dem Zusammenhang mit den Beschäftigten. Danke.
Vielen Dank für diese Ausführungen. I think you all had translations, those that needed it. There was a lot of in it on internationalization, shorter working hours, the question of conversion to alternative products that we actually haven't talked a lot about. Maybe some of you would like to focus on this, but also the question of democracy. So who decides what is being produced? There was one more question here.
Yeah, thank you. My name's Matthew. I'm from Scotland, and I find that discussion extremely helpful. in reminding me that within the workers' movement and within the climate movement, there is always disagreement and always debate. And my reflection, it actually was my reflection when as a trade unionist, I started to be a climate activist, that there is this tension within a labor framework between the immediate interests and concerns of workers as they confront them in their workplace and their needs in the long term as they confront climate crisis. And I've got just a couple of points and questions about this. The first is, I think personally, but I'm interested to know whether when we try and create that vision of an alternative in which we can bridge that gap between the long term and the immediate, first of all, if in order to do that, we have to place ourselves in both the workers' movement and the climate movement. I liked your points about the debates within the climate movement about neoliberalism, and I will do a workshop later in which I will look at how we frame in Scotland that partnership between labour and trade unions in ways that we try to do that. But my actual also provocative point is that if we look at the left and we look at that challenge of creating that vision, I would suggest that there is no correlation in terms of how far to the left or the right you are on whether you've got a useful contribution to those kind of debates. I have seen social democrats who have got a lot more better, right-wing social democrats who have a lot more to say on that issue than the most revolutionary Marxists. So if we are all on the left, I'm sort of getting down to a question about how we actually require of our comrades that they focus on this very, very important challenge. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to have a look at the gender balance. I see it. But, so I see you. Thank you. Are there any other questions or hands that I might have missed? Yes, we have one there. And then
I was wondering, shall I ask a question now? And you made me do so. My name is Astrid Kaag. I'm from the Netherlands, from FNV. I was wondering, when we are discussing, I hear us talking a lot about the workers. But actually, I was wondering about who we are talking, because as we all know, at least in Western Europe, the workforce is completely changed from like 50 years before. And sometimes I have the feeling that we are mainly talking about blue-collar workers, manual workers, a lot of them male, like industries, construction. And we know that the workforce is now, in our countries, it's services, it's a lot of workers are doing quite well, working at banks, insurances. So I thought, that makes me think also about when we say the workers are walking with the fascists, for example, or with the far right, and looking for explanations. Are we just mainly looking at these type of workers? I don't know if these blue-collar workers, are those the ones who are mainly going with the far right, or is the picture broader? Are we speaking about a broader group of workers? I'm really wondering about that.
thanks a lot. So then I take your question as the final question.
Well, thank you very much, of course, for the presentations. I have a question more like, I think, towards Professor Schaupp's work, because I'm trying to do something similar, and like regarding the effects of climate change on workers' health specifically, and I'm really trying to, like, from my experience in the field work, it's really hard to deal specifically with this question, in the sense that oftentimes the workers that I speak with have so much else going on, like regarding to occupational hazard and safety issues, that when I try to get to climate change related noxiousness and like the heat, I don't feel like it's always a priority, because there is like so much that we have to deal with, and I feel like it kind of acts as like a it increases an already present vulnerability. And I also wonder, from like my perspective, I'm really struggling to find a way to find concrete solution and proposals, both like for me and both like for them, because you know, like adaptation is really important in this kind of job. You know, like stop the work during the hottest hours, or trying to remodulate like how we will think the work. But then, like compared to traditional noxiousness related to the workplace, like I don't know, like asbestos or this kind of stuff, it was easy to pinpoint the specific source of noxiousness and interact with that source of noxiousness. You know, like the plant, the fabric was the main source of harm. But with climate change, the source of harm is, you know, like ever present. The problem is a burning planet and not only a polluting facility. So I'm not sure where to put my mind, because I think it should be, you know, like a systemic change. You know, you can't just, you know, like deal with it. You can't, you don't have like a specific immediate solution to tackle it, because it will be, you know, like it will mean to deal with climate change, which of course is like a much broader and global problem. But on the other side, we need, of course, like immediate solution to preserve workers' health and to deal with the noxiousness that they are experiencing firsthand during their work. And also, I'm also... Okay.
No, just can you try to come to
okay,
the
sorry,
point?
stop.
No,
No,
it
was just like a, I don't know, like something that I'm struggling with, and maybe we can interact with that. But stop.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. So I think this was one specific question for Simon. We had a lot of more general question, but also comments. I would like to have one closing round at the panel, so please pick one of the questions you would like to answer, or further comment on comments, and please try to be precise. And I would like to give you one closing question, actually, on mentioning one final. What do you think? What would be one important entry point you think it would be most important to focus on when we continue to work on labor environmentalism? So to include in your final statement one important entry point you find particularly important. We start with you, Simon, because there was a specific question also to you.
Okay, maybe I can answer this and also some of the other questions with emphasizing the importance of exhaustion as like one really important access point for addressing these issues without relying on like abstract political programs, which are highly contested and where the chances of reaching people are ever decreasing. And I think addressing ecological issues at the workplace in connection to the experience of exhaustion is the most promising access that I came across so far, because the experience of exhaustion is the direct result of the expansionist dynamic of capital accumulation. It's a necessary consequence. Because there is a necessary drive to accumulate, there is also the necessity to increase sometimes the absolute amount of working hours, but in most cases the intensity of work, which then produces the experience of exhaustion. And this is something that brings together blue-collar workers, white-collar workers, and all the different occupations and different forms of work, which are often portrayed as being on different side of like a culture war, where there are the bad production workers and the good care workers or whatever. And I think all of them are connected by the experience of exhaustion, which many of the people that I talk to directly connect to the ecological destruction of their industry and of other industries. So for most people, it's clear that it's not an option to ever increase the speed of work, the speed of construction, that this is harming both themselves and the environment. So what results from that is demands of working hours reduction as like a central sustainable policy, because that reduces, as the colleague said before, either the amount of output, but even if the amount of output stays the same, it reduces, for example, the commuting pollution if you have a 4-hour working week, or the necessity of defensive consumption, of engaging in energy-intensive wellness activities, or expensive and energy-intensive fast food, frozen food, or vacation, etc. Yeah. So I think that's an important point.
Stefanie?
Yeah, so first, again, to the hierarchy that was mentioned, and I would call it objectification in capitalist production. I think this idea of dignity is so important because it means that on the everyday basis, as we described, this is the effort to be a human, a subject, within these objectifying structures. So as workers express themselves, I mean, there's a question, who are the workers? So, okay, we can put ourselves in, I would say, but there are expressions like we don't want to be treated as numbers, we don't want to be treated as machines that can run for 24 hours, we don't want to be treated as waste, we don't want to be treated as tools for others, for shareholders, for example. So this means the everyday positioning of oneself as not being a poor, object in this capitalist structure, in this hierarchical capitalist structure, is important when it comes to dignity. And as I said, in fascisation, this turns. Then now it is the own and lonely struggle to be the subject against others. This is the turn. And to hinder that and to strengthen the other position of dignity and humanity and so on, we have to be aware of it on the everyday struggle. So again, the first point. Second point, there was a question, and many ask about what to do. And my proposition would really be to concentrate on the notion of labor and to build up networks in which different, workers in a large sense, now not only workers in capitalist production and industrial production, do recognize themselves as those who produce society. I mean, this is also true for care work, this is true for what we call as volunteer work, and so on. So building up, cross-branch, but also cross-sector networks, and not to blame each other as, being the good or the bad ones. Workers are not better than us, sitting in the room. We are all using all this material which is produced under slavery conditions sometimes. You know this in China, in Latin America, but also so we are not the good ones. And so to end up with this morality in the debate, but to, shift the notion of labor together. And my last point is, you put it on the table already, both, is that with Nancy Fraser, I think this is very important, treating the ecological question as an isolated issue enforces hierarchy and does not change anything, because exploitation, alienation, unevenness is not put in. So she argues in favor of what she calls trans-ecological perspective. And I would say, taking up this notion of exhaustion, this trans-ecological perspective is needed in particular when it comes to our all, but in particular also workers' bodies. We have a round in 1 hour about exhaustion, in particular in the automotive industry. So exhaustion can be an entry point, but this is not, just a tactic or so, but there is no, I would say, isolated ecological question. There is the body, our all working bodies' vulnerability in in the question, and so we have to combine it and to develop trans-ecological perspectives and not isolated issues. This is the proposition of Nancy Fraser and me.
Thank you. Silpa, please, your final remarks.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll start with transnationalism. Sorry. I mean, we are living in a moment where there are ultra-nationalist tendencies across the world. So the moment you enforce progressive worker right policies in one country, it's very easy for you to shift to another country, your production or operation. You can just shift the burden to somewhere else in your supply chain where the regulations are very poor. There are no proper regulations to ensure their worker rights are protected or environmental rights are protected. So that also creates a lot of problems unless we all come on board. It was very easy to shift the burden to somewhere else. Second point on workers and who are the workers we talk about. The conflict that I was trying to feature, they were both belonging to broadly the left of the political spectrum. They had clear affiliations to leftist political parties in the state. They're also interesting that they completely abandoned fascist tendencies and authoritarian populism, even including neoliberal capitalism on paper and part of the manifesto. Social aspects of it is condemned. However, you can see that when you talk to them, economic aspects of it in terms of more accumulation, growth, the bandwagon of progress, etc., is put forward by a certain category of workers. So it is an interesting case. Finally, the question on left, right? There are different shades of left politics, and when you look into countries in the global south, especially the setting where I was talking about, you cannot just have one homogeneous understanding of what it does mean to belong to the left of the political spectrum. There are variations in terms of the extent to which you would want to go to protect workers as well as environment and also respect social reproduction activities. So I think it will be a mistake for us to consider of only left as one homogeneous entity, and I think your comment is very important on that respect. Finally, I think the way forward, we have all internalized capitalist logic from a very young age, the things that you learn in school in terms of GDP, more economic growth. So by the time you end up being a part of the working force, including people irrespective of which sector you belong to. So this is so normalized, and the other side is very limited in terms of your popular discourse or public education for that matter, at least in the context of India. So the moment you talk about something like degrowth, I'm not saying it is not devoid of critics, but wanting to slow down, it's very difficult to get across, also because of the unique histories that countries had to go through, colonial domination for so long. So it varies across setting. The moment you talk about slowing down or, talk about dignity or talking about workers' well-being, as one of the panelists said, your immediate necessity is to meet your daily bread and butter. So once you do not ensure that, it will become very difficult for you to get to the next plane as to building solidarities for building a better planet, planetary justice, etc. So I think we have to start from a very young age to also enable people to imagine beyond capitalist logics of production where you emphasize well-being first and profits later on. I'll wrap with that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much to my panelists and to all of you in the audience for questions and comments. We will now have 1 hour of break. I was asked to announce that the workshops E1 and F1 take place in the other building at Franz-Mehring-Platz 1, so you need about 10 minutes to go there. So it's the workshops E1 and F1. So everyone who registered for these workshops, they take place at